that slide and hear me
Yep.
okay?
Yep.
All right, thanks. Well, yeah, thanks for having me and inviting me. So, yeah, my talk today is part of some research that I'm doing for a master's in higher education that I'm studying for at the minute with my university's teaching academy. And it's kind of, I'm also the UK Reproducibility Network local lead at MMU. And so that role is about kind of promoting open science and open research in the university. So I'm kind of interested in, how does that actually work in practice in terms of promoting, developing kind of systems and ways of promoting open research in the way that universities are currently kind of structured and organized. So I'm going to start off by discussing this concept of academic capitalism, which is a theory from the literature of higher education research. And it describes the tendency or the fact that universities operate in markets and compete with each other over economic and social capital. So basically money and reputation. And, the fact that these markets exist is a result of greater forces of neoliberalism and political decisions. And the way that academic capitalism is, I guess, observed is or manifested is in the application of kind of managerial logic to the way that universities are run. And universities compete over a lot of different things. They compete over teaching, so to attract students and student fees, and over, competing over student graduate outcomes. They compete over the facilities and services that they have, academic services, student support, things like that. And what I'm going to be talking about today is how they compete over research. And winners and losers of these competitions are judged kind of visibly by the performance of university in university rankings. So you're probably all familiar with these. There's lots of different ones available, but they all do similar things, which is to, measure the performance of universities on teaching, research, and facilities, and then, put this into an overall score where the performance overall can be assessed and who is winning the competition. So in terms of academic capitalism and research in particular, universities are competing over research funding, and they're competing over the quality of the research that they produce. And they're competing to make money by, if possible, commodifying the knowledge that they develop and the research that they do. And so this competition influences the way that research is organized within universities, which areas of research are funded, and who is employed and how to do research. So before I to provide a point of contrast to what I'll be talking about slightly later is, what is the traditional perspective then of the way that research is organized? And this is that research as a kind of, human endeavor in universities is really managed by a self-regulated community of academics. So it's the academics community that decides what to research. And researchers are, really doing this because they're intrinsically motivated to find out new knowledge. They're curious explorers who are driven by these Merton's scientific values of, wanting to uncover knowledge using disinterestedness and working together and having this kind of organized skepticism. And the community of academics are the ones who are in charge of assessing the quality of each other's outputs in a qualitative way, for instance, via peer review. And knowledge is, in this model, produced as a public good, and that, as opposed to private good. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's public to the general public, but that researchers are doing research and generating knowledge to share it with each other rather than to privatize it and make money. And in this model, the university itself is kind of a bit in the background, really. It serves more as a way of organizing academics, or perhaps more as like a platform to support researchers. And in itself, it is kind of in the background, and it is run by academics as a collegial community of scholars and students. And students in this model kind of come to university to learn from researchers, learn how to be a part of this community that's generating knowledge, and teaching and research, enhance each other in this respect. So it's all kind of a very, wholesome endeavor of everyone working together for this purpose of generating knowledge. Now, before I kind of go on to contrast this, I think it's worth pointing out at this point that there's a kind of a tendency in some of this literature to look back at this traditional perspective with rose-tinted glasses, and basically to use terms like capitalism and neoliberalism to describe anything that is new and that you don't like. So I actually kind of think that perhaps traditional is maybe not the right word, actually, and it's slightly more of a utopian perspective of how research should be done, and almost certainly not historically accurate that it ever was exactly like that. For one thing, academics, whilst they may have collectively decided on what is researched, that's not necessarily to say that they always agreed on this. So there have always been disagreements over the value of different types of research, different disciplines kind of looking down their noses at each other about competing over whose is the purest, most theoretical discipline, and people doing, applied practical work perhaps not valued as much. There's always been competition in this system between universities, disciplines, and researchers for things like reputation, success, and awards. And it's certainly not a kind of fair meritocratic system. It's not that everyone's contribution to knowledge was valued equally. Careers, promotion, hiring, awards, peer review, have all been influenced and abused sometimes by people's reputation, by their social networks, this concept of old boys clubs kind of running departments, and of course like misogyny and racism. So before we move on to discussing the kind of capitalist university, it's important to say, the alternative was not perfect either by any stretch of the imagination. But we can see differences between this traditional perspective and the way that modern universities are run, and in particular run research. So in the modern university, the university itself isn't really a passive background actor. It's a kind of main player in itself and strategically manages the endeavor of research. So universities have input into the research agenda and what is researched. The university is primarily extrinsically motivated to conduct research to gain capital and move up the rankings. It's not necessarily interested in itself in the knowledge that it generates, unless it can be, commodified in some way. And in this, the term entrepreneurs has been used to describe how researchers work in this. So, they're trying to invent new things and new knowledge, but for the purpose of selling it. And that's what the university tries to get them to do. The quality of the research and the output is quantified and assessed using metrics and software. And universities are run not really by academics, but by administrators and managers, and they're run as businesses where researchers are the employees, employed to produce research. And in this model, teaching and research are quite often sometimes separated completely, with different, certain staff who do the teaching and other completely different staff who do the research. So it kind of precludes the possibility of that idea of a community of scholars and students working together and teaching and research enhancing each other. So, these are all kind of quite vague principles. So the next part of the talk, I'm going to kind of discuss some, real world examples of where we can see this. And the first is in that idea of the university strategically managing research. So this is a diagram of how research is organized in my faculty, or was. And I mean, don't ask me to tell you what all the different arrows are supposed to mean and represent, but it's a clear example of how there is a top-down, model of how the research is going to run in this faculty. And one of the kind of key bits of it is this bit in the middle and the cross-theme clusters of excellence, which is the areas that the university says, that is what we are good at, and that's what we want to try and develop a reputation in. And of course, universities have always had areas of strength, and a lot of that is based on the resources that they have, right? If you have a rare and expensive resource like a sleep laboratory, it's unsurprising that you might have a lot of researchers who are known for doing good research into sleep. But this is more of a kind of top-down way of deliberately trying to organize researchers into what they're good at. And the university then tries to direct resources into these areas to improve it. So for instance, if I want to apply for a grant, whether that's internal or external, I have to convince the university that it is going to be my research is going to fit into one of these areas. And obviously that also applies about how we hire new staff, that we want to hire, new researchers and new professors that fit into these categories as well. The second example that I'm sure any researchers in the room will be familiar with is the measurement of research output through metrics. So the quality of research produced is measured through numbers such as the number of the star rating for the ref papers, so the 3-star, 4-star papers that are used in the UK, exercise of assessing research quality at universities, the number of citations that research gets, alt metrics, which are about how much impact research is having on social media or in the news, journal impact factors and journal rankings, so whether the places that you're publishing your research are good. And universities use these measures not just as measures of the quality of the research produced, but also of the researchers and their performance. And it collects information about these through using software such as Pure. The one that we use at MMU is called Symplectic. There's another one called Core, and they're kind of pieces of software where that record, what the employees of the university are producing in terms of the articles and what their metrics are. And most of these services, certainly Pure and Symplectic, are run by companies on what's called a platform capitalism model, which is a bit like Facebook, right? So you provide your data to Facebook for free, and then it, has these massive data sets that it can analyze and sell to advertisers. In the case of these, you provide your data to the Symplectic or Pure for free, and then the people who run them will sell the data analytics back to your institution or to governments or to funders of research. And, an example of how these then are used to by the university to kind of manage research is that, your university says, well, why don't you use these systems and tell us all about the research that you're doing and put it into it. An example of Pure is one of the most popular ones. Pure is owned by the publishing company Elsevier, who also publish a lot of journals and so have a lot of data from that part of their business. And then they sell analytical services about research performance to funders and universities. And they say, this can be used by your institution to assess performance of researchers, plan for the future, and with faculty, staff, recruitment and retention. And, it's not surprising or kind of bad that these things are really used in, for instance, like hiring or promotion decisions, because, you want to obviously employ people who are, when you're employing new people, you want to make sure that they know what they're doing. And if you're promoting people to high ranks, you want to make sure they're competent at that. But maybe I'm reading too much into the word retention here, but, they can also be used as a stick to kind of, perhaps control the employment of researchers as well, who they already employ. And one kind of case study of this that happened very recently last year was at the University of Liverpool, where they had a restructuring project called Project Shape. And this was basically proposing to fire 47 researchers in the Faculty of Health and Life Sciences, and based in large part on the metrics that they had. So they compared the performance of their staff against those at other institutions, in particular the amount of money they'd brought in and the citation impact that they had. And this was to, in their words, to establish a stronger connection between our research capabilities and performance. And, thankfully that after this was eventually reduced to 2 redundancies after weeks of strikes and finally resolved after threats of further strikes. But it's a good example that shows how these metrics and stuff are being used, to manage researchers. And there's a couple of links there about this case study. And the third example then is about administration and bureaucracy. So when the institution is managing its researchers, to a certain extent, it wants to standardize the research process or how research is done. And this is to ensure both kind of that people are following its internal procedures, but also, things like legislation. If you're the university, you don't want your head in the clouds professor just emailing his collaborator in America with, the data set in a flagrant breach of GDPR legislation. You want to make sure that the researchers are kind of following these rules. And so, in order to do that, you need to get them to, you need to have procedures and documents to enable that monitoring and audit. So our university, this is on our research webpage, they've developed a number of SOPs, so standard operating procedures about how to do a piece of research, what forms you need to fill in at what stages, who you need to talk to. I particularly like the fact that we have a standard operating procedure for writing standard operating procedures. And the way that most researchers and academics will then encounter this is through filling out forms. So if you want to do a piece of research at MMU, you need to fill out a 20-page ethics application, a 12-page research protocol document, a 10-page data management plan. And if you're doing any kind of research on, using personal data, so like transferring that or processing it on any kind of scale, then you should also probably fill out a 16-page data protection impact assessment and perhaps a 6-page information security assessment as well. So, overall, these kind of provide some examples of how the management of research has, shifted from perhaps something that was in most part managed by academics to something that is managed by the university. Okay, so the second part of the talk then, we're going to move on to open research, and then we're going to bring the two things together at the end. So open research, as probably most people will be familiar with, was this kind of initially a grassroots movement with the aim of making the whole research process transparent and accessible. And to give an example of what this looks like, a traditional research output would be something like this. This is not to pick on this one in particular, it's just one that we use in our research methods classes. It's a PDF report of a piece of research And we have no access to what the researchers plan to do, the data, the materials, how they analysed the data, how it was reviewed. All we've got to go off is it's just their summary of what they did. So looking at the numbers in the results section of this document. And in this particular example, we don't even have p-values. It's just a graph and the f-values and mean standard error from the ANOVA. So that's all we have to go off to judge what they did and what the results of their research are, and whether it was all done, properly and correctly. And that is even if you have access to the actual article itself. If your university library doesn't subscribe to the journal, perhaps you even only have access to the abstract. In contrast, a piece of open research, and this is a kind of theoretical, perfectly open, exemplar, is that we would have access to a detailed pre-registration of the research. So a plan of exactly what the researchers aimed to do in the first place, what data they were going to collect, how they planned to analyze it. And this would be time-stamped to before they conducted it. So we know that this was what they initially planned to do. We would have access to all the materials that they used, so the actual word-for-word questionnaire that they used in the research, as well as any kind of experimental stimuli or other materials. We would have access to the raw data set, or as raw as possible, as well as any documentation that would help us to interpret it, so about how it's set up or any data they excluded and why. And that would be open data. We would have access to the exact analysis code that they used, if it's quantitative research or perhaps a kind of coding document for qualitative research about how they came up with their themes. And if it's quantitative code, that might have even been checked by a third person external body to verify that if you run this code on this data set, it produces the numbers in the paper. The research would be reported to standardized reporting guidelines to make sure that any possible bit of information that anyone would want to know about the study has been recorded and written down somewhere. You would be able to view the entire peer review history of the paper, so what the reviewers said, how the authors responded, the decisions, see how the paper had changed over that period. You'd be able to see exactly what the authors did as part of the research, so who did what, who came up with the idea, who analysed the data, who wrote the actual paper. Obviously, the actual paper itself would be open access to free for everyone. And finally, you might see the authors engaging in post-publication peer review. So on a website such as PubPeer, where people can comment on articles and the authors can respond to it to kind of continue that peer review process. So what are the benefits of working like this? Well, the main one is that, well, the main two are that it facilitates the production of multi-purpose, reliable knowledge. So if there was any fraud or bias or questionable research practices or even just human error in the research, then we know about it because we can see everything that was done. So if we want to build on that research, we can have more confidence that the results are kind of correct from the purposes of doing the research. And because the materials and data and code are all available, they can all be reused by other researchers. So across the whole research endeavor, it reduces the reproduction of effort. And working openly also then facilitates other definitions of open research. So it facilitates scaling up research to work in bigger teams. It facilitates doing research in or working with researchers in other countries that might have less resources. It facilitates getting the general public involved in citizen science. It facilitates teaching, with open data sets, you can use them to help teach students about research. And it facilitates diversity and inclusivity initiatives. And you would say that overall that these open research practices and using them are a lot more aligned with that initial, that kind of traditional perspective of research, of everyone working together and removing bias from research and those Miltonian values. So for the third part then of my talk, I'm going to talk about how these things interact with each other. So academic capitalism is a trend for how research is being managed in universities. Open research is a trend for how research is being done. How are they going to interact with each other, and what does that mean for the future? And the first bit is looking at the areas of opposition. So where do these things kind of clash? And the first is that, and kind of most obvious one, I think, is that open research in its name promotes research sharing all knowledge for free as a public good. So it's pretty, completely opposed to any kind of commodifying or privatizing knowledge and kind of keeping it locked behind, which is, as we've kind of mentioned, is a part of that academic capitalism. Working openly and transparently disincentivizes questionable research practices and academics who might be, or researchers who are kind of gaming the metric-based assessment of research in this kind of academic capitalist way. So if you're assessed on the number of publications, then you can slice up one piece of research into 5 different publications to improve that. And working openly disincentivizes that because it's kind of very obvious. And it also promotes the continued quality assessment of research by the scientific community, because we have access to everything here. It's not just the number of citations on the PDF. We can see overall how good the research is, and the quality of it might vary over time with how with new developments and how the data set and things are being used in the future. And because open research is about sharing resources, it's kind of opposed to the idea of competing for grant money and competing for citations. You want to try and share resources with other researchers, sometimes even kind of formally. So where previously you might have had 2 labs who are working on the same project or the same area, but not sharing their data with each other because they don't want the other one to get ahead. If everyone's working openly, it facilitates things like adversarial collaborations and actually saying, look, why don't you 2 groups get together and put your heads together and work together on this? And finally, as I kind of mentioned before, it enables collaboration on a huge scale and helps under-resourced colleagues, who might not have access to materials or code or things like that. And it promotes sharing the benefits generated. So putting all of the people who contributed to research on the authorship list and then explaining what they all did. Somewhat unbelievably, I will have a paper published in Nature earlier this year because I'm one of 500 authors on the Psychological Science Accelerator project. And even though I only helped to collect, 2% of that data, it shares that kind of benefit of that type of publication. So on the face of it, open research seems kind of pretty opposed to academic capitalism, and perhaps, a lot of the kind of solutions to some of the things that we might not like about it. But I'm kind of quite interested as well in the areas that it might align. And the first one of these is that open research is going to inevitably generate new metrics to assess the performance of researchers. And in a way, this has been something that has actually been indirectly advocated for from grassroots open research people for a long time, because there's this acknowledgement that, well, people are not going to do open research when it's disadvantaging them in the current incentive system. If it takes you a lot longer to do open research, you're going to get less publications, and people who are doing closed research are going to benefit because you're falling behind. So quite early on, there was this kind of development of this idea that we need to kind of come up with new ways of measuring research performance to take into account this. And this has been discussed, these are a couple of links to documents that are kind of quite high level, EU funding and multi-actor, scholarly documents about how we could do this, how could we measure research, open research. And there was also a kind of ill-fated attempt by this guy to create rankings of researchers about how open their research was. And this led to quite a backlash from the community about saying, well, we don't want this, it's not the way that open research is supposed to be. But I don't really see a huge amount of difference between what he was doing and what these other documents are proposing, would be done as well. And obviously the kind of issue with this is that just assessing research with new numbers has a lot of the same problems as the old ones. So by definition, quantitative measurement is reductionist and removes the context of the research. And it contributes to a lack of trust, in the sense that if you are primarily just assessed by, your numbers rather than a more rounded view of what you're doing, then it contributes to this lack of trust, that people don't trust that you're doing your job properly. It reduces people's intrinsic motivation to perform these behaviors. And this was a kind of big part of a lot of the early grassroots open research stuff, was saying, oh, well, the benefits of using it are that, that you're going to be doing the right thing, and that you're going to be doing research properly. You'll have greater faith in research, and these open ways of working are actually going to help you do better research. So, really linked to that idea that researchers are intrinsically motivated to generate knowledge. But when you start assessing that with external metrics, it does reduce that intrinsic motivation. And if you're kind of not even perhaps, if you don't really understand exactly why you're being measured on these things, it increases this threat of what's called policy alienation, where you just disengage with it, and you almost try and work against it out of spite because you don't like what it's doing. And assessment of research by metrics is already, acknowledged to be biased towards quantitative research and STEM, science, technology disciplines. And it's with the open research, that's definitely still a risk as well. For things like the humanities, it's not even exactly clear what constitutes data, let alone what open data would look like. And again, kind of early on in earlier in the grassroots movement of open science and open research, there was this really nice kind of buffet metaphor of saying, well, open research practices are like a buffet. You can come and pick up a couple and use the ones that are applicable to you. And, when you feel that you're kind of comfortable with them, you can come back and perhaps try a few more. And that acknowledges, diversity and inequalities in the researchers who are using them. And it's quite difficult to see how assessment by metrics kind of accommodates an approach like that, where, the different bits are kind of optional and a more gradual building of it. And the people proposing these new metrics have kind of acknowledged this and said, well, don't worry, guys, these new metrics will be responsible metrics. They're going to be based on the best possible data. So these ones are going to be accurate at assessing, what's good about research. And, they're going to be, they won't replace qualitative evaluation. They're just there to help. And if it seems they're not working properly, then don't worry, we'll regularly review them to make sure that they are working properly, and we'll fine tune them until they do work. And don't worry about people gaming these metrics, because they can't be gamed. if researchers try to game them, then it's going to be obvious, and so they'll suffer reputational costs. And you kind of think, well, it was obvious that people were gaming the old metrics, and they didn't suffer reputational costs. In fact, it benefited them greatly. So I'm not entirely sure how that kind of works with the new ones. And the thing with metrics is that they're also difficult to remove. Once you've got them in place, the argument is always to try and improve them, usually by making them more complicated and not, developing them, not just taking them away. And there's a kind of really nice point in this book by Muller about metrics that says where the kind of idea of measuring stuff to improve it came from is the private sector. But in the private sector, there's a kind of natural limit to the amount that this happens, because at the end of the day, you have to make a profit. And so if you're spending all your money on just assessing, improving the efficiency of stuff, eventually it's going to get to a point where it's unprofitable to do that. But in research, where there's not that kind of direct link between income and profit, or the amount of money you're putting into something and the profit, it's unclear to see where that starts to have diminishing returns. And there's been a huge growth in research administration in universities, as we've mentioned, as well as in the investment and development of research analytics, and even in the growth of this whole kind of meta-science movement, meta-science research discipline in itself, with researchers researching how the process of research can be improved. And if that is helping to improve the quality of the actual research, then that's good, but it's kind of unclear about where that starts to have diminishing returns as well. And there is a lot of money and time and effort of a lot of smart people going into this, and if that's having a benefit, that's great, but it's also a lot of time and money and effort that's not being put into doing actual research of curing cancer or things like that. The second kind of part of this then is that obviously if universities start getting assessed on how open their research is, and that's something that feeds into something like university rankings, then they're going to want to take more control of it, which is going to inevitably lead to more bureaucracy and administration. So there's been suggestions to say, oh, there's only a few additional steps to incorporate a pre-registration into your ethics application. But maybe pre-registration is another extra 12-page document on top of that. And there's also, some interesting points about, how's it going to work with sharing materials? Universities are not going to want academics sharing stuff that they don't have the copyright for and getting in trouble for that. So you can imagine that there'll be there'll be more forms to fill out to make sure that's not the case. And there's a paper here where they talk about how researchers were developing a piece of software with others at a different institution, and they couldn't agree on whether it should be open or not. So then you're going to have agreements in advance about what's going to be shared and who's going to get the credit for it. And it also takes time and effort to provide the information for these metrics as well. And one example that you might kind of use as a similar thing of how an institution has perhaps mismanaged the process of research is in ethics. This is one area of institutional research management that is already commonly criticized as being, created by and justified by a scandal or crisis, and then expanded gradually by bureaucratic turf grabbing. It employs a kind of costly and time-consuming event licensing process for every piece of research conducted has to go through ethical approval. Anyone who's submitted more than one ethics application has probably experienced inconsistent decision-making and a lack of a kind of necessarily coherent framework for the decisions, attend to ideological and methodological orthodoxy of what constitutes research and what is good research practice, and unaccountable decisions. And I would say it's not too difficult to imagine in the future, 10 years time, one university's kind of ham-fisted attempt to manage open research suffering from all of these 6 types of problem. And my final point then is about perhaps a bit more speculative, but about how open research might facilitate changes to academic labour and the role of a researcher. So at the minute, researchers or academics, they do a bit of everything. This is an example of what's called the researcher development framework, which is often used to help develop PhD students to be well-rounded academics. And it covers all the possible things that you would do as a researcher. So teaching, research, lots of other scholarly activities. And, you know, when you in these kind of traditional research outputs, this is quite a good example. It's 2 authors, there's 3 simple studies, and it's pretty feasible that both authors just did a bit of everything as part of that. But in these large-scale open research projects, where, you know, it's a huge amount of extra work to do all these things properly, and in these big team projects, you might have thousands or even tens of thousands of participants and dozens or even hundreds of authors. So in those types of projects, you know, researchers tend to take on specialist roles of just doing one part of it, and, you know, there's this clear contribution statement of who did what. And those large complex projects are much more efficient when people specialize in one area rather than everyone trying to do a bit of everything. And in those contexts, the role of the do a bit of everything academic seems a bit, you know, antiquated or out of date. And this is something that has been talked about in the open research literature, saying, you know, team-based research is the future. Specialization means that the allocation of resources is going to shift to more effective combinations of teams of researchers, and that the days of the lone genius as the model of a researcher are going, or if not gone already. Now, this type of working is arguably more efficient for advancing knowledge. You know, it's the type of knowledge produced in a massive open research team project like this is objectively in some ways better than the knowledge that's produced with lots of small outputs. And this is the same to a certain extent in qualitative work with the growth of interdisciplinary mixed methods teams and the role of qualitative researchers in these big team projects as well. Now, there's this growing workload concerns in academia in the UK, especially. You know, I was on strike earlier this week, partly about workload. And the union says, yeah, if academics should have time in their work for research administration, other types of administration. And open research takes the time, additional time to do all of these things. And so for the university, the only kind of solution to that is to hire a lot more staff to do all of these things. But from the university's perspective, is hiring a lot more all-round staff to each do a little bit of everything actually an efficient use of resources when these kind of bigger team projects are, you know, perhaps going to be rewarded more in the future as well? And there's a nice paper by Eugen Tunch preprint recently. It says, well, it's a fallacy to say that open research is neoliberal just because they both use the word efficiency, right? Because critics of open research say that, well, yeah, open research is this neoliberal scheme to make academics more efficient. You know, it's going to increase workload, get them to try and produce more as part of a piece of research, and it's governed by these new measures of assessment. And okay, well, you're not really describing open research itself there, you're describing academic capitalism. And open research, efficiency in open research is about, you know, the efficiency of scientific progress and not publishing a load of small, sloppy, useless papers for people to advance their careers instead. But the thing is that the critics of open research are they're not wrong in the sense that it would increase workload and expect more of people under the current system of an academic trying to do a bit of everything. And if the solution is that, well, actually, efficient knowledge production needs the reorganization of academic labor, then, you know, do we need to be a bit more open with researchers and saying, look, you are going to be asked to do a bit more. And if you try and do everything, it's not going to work. So you need to actually change the way that you work, because universities are not going to give you more time to do a bit of everything. You're already on strike about that. And this is not a process that's unique to open research. It's already something that's been written about for the last 10 years, that there's this unbundling of academic labour and new roles where people are specialising more in one aspect of being an academic than another. And you can kind of see why people are a bit hesitant about this then, because people I'm an academic, I like doing a bit of everything. And you can see why people are also a bit hesitant to reveal what they're doing, not just to other academics, but to their universities. When you have the kind of traditional way of working, it's a bit of a black box. It's not, you might have a workload model for the year, but on a day-to-day basis, it's not, no one's looking over your shoulder and saying, what are you doing? And so this black box kind of produces traditional research outputs every now and again that the university can measure and assess people on. And it might conceal a lot of bias and errors and fraud and inefficiency. But to a certain extent, it is resistant to being micromanaged, because the university doesn't actually really know exactly what you do all the time. So it can't micromanage you. It's not tinkering with the actual process of doing research. Whereas with transparent working, it becomes obvious what your job is and what you do and the quality of the actual thing that you are doing on a day-to-day basis in terms of analyzing data or whatever. So people are kind of scared perhaps that, well, it's going to facilitate the university breaking down the research process and saying, oh, actually, we could be a lot more efficient at producing stuff if we, only employed a data analyst for one job and, only employed someone to do the data curation for another job, or only employed someone else to do the software for another job. So it makes it more amenable to kind of atypical contracts and, the university saying, yeah, actually, we can be a lot more efficient at producing research by exploiting people a bit more and putting them on different contracts and getting them to do different things. So this is my final slide. I've gone over a little bit. Is that, is this reorganization of academic labour then, is it progressive or is it exploitative? And it kind of depends on your perspective. Is unbundling labour into these and research labour into these different parts, is that upskilling the existing lab technician who doesn't get credit on paper and actually saying, hey, you're actually a vital part of the research process here. You should have your own career track and be rewarded just as much. Or is it de-skilling, the all-round academic by saying, well, actually, you're not quite as important to this process as you thought you were, because we've got this other person to do this bit of the job, and you don't actually need to know how to do that anymore. So it kind of offers the university the opportunity to extend managerialism, standardization, bureaucracy, and exploit academic labour in new ways for its own benefit of moving up university rankings. But it also doesn't have to be like that. It could offer, the opportunity to reorganize academic labour to be fairer, improve diversity, reward previously undervalued skills, and develop careers and promote participation and inclusion in new ways. But if that is the case, does that mean an end to the all-round academic and what McFarlane here calls, the spirit of research as being something that you can't actually really break down into lots of bits? It's more of a, in some ways, a tradition of philosophical reflection and broader intellectual engagement. And that's what being a researcher and an academic is about. And I'll just end with a kind of analogy of this, which is when I was a PhD student, I went to a talk by the university arranged a panel talk about the legalization of drugs. And they had Professor David Nutt there, who was the drugs czar for the UK government, talking about how legalizing drugs would help him research them to discover new medicines. And they had another person talking about how legalizing drugs is great because it doesn't treat addicts as criminals. And you had another person saying that the current criminalization of drugs is, harmful to minorities. And the audience for this talk was, it was packed, and it was pretty much exclusively, kind of hippie liberal students who were all like nodding along very vigorously and clapping and cheering. And towards the end, there was one guy on the panel who was like, look, this is kind of supposed to be a debate, really. So I know that everyone agrees here that, they should be legalized, but I'm going to introduce a kind of counterpoint because it's supposed to be a debate. And he said, everyone, let's take the example of like legalizing cannabis. Objectively, that is great for a lot of you who might use it, because you're not going to be criminalized for accessing it anymore. It'll be easier to buy it. It'll be cheaper. The quality will go up. It'll have all these other benefits of people using it. But it will also lose something, because if you look at America, where they've done that, immediately capitalists come in, there's money to be made, and it becomes just a business like anything else. And it loses its essence of being, a symbolic countercultural symbol of a transgressive identity. And you don't get that back then. And I kind of think, is that an analogy of saying, yeah, we can completely reorient the way that research works, we can do all this stuff, but is that going to lose the kind of the spirit of research of the all-round academic? And is that a good thing or not? Is that worth it? So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.